In 2022, during what was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday family dinner, my daughter-in-law, Jessica, stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the hardwood floor. The sound was ugly and loud, silencing the clinking of forks and my grandson's cheerful babbling. She pointed a trembling finger at me from across the table. In front of my son, my grandchildren, and her own parents, she yelled, "Get a job and stop being a leech, Carol." The words didn't just hang in the air. They seemed to suck all the warmth out of the room. A leech, a parasite. It wasn't the insult itself that cut so deeply, but the sheer, unadulterated contempt behind it. I saw the looks dart across the table. Her parents stared at their plates, suddenly fascinated by the floral pattern. My son, Mark, looked trapped, a deer in the headlights, his gaze flicking between his wife and me. I held his eyes for a moment, saw the conflict, the shame, and the heartbreaking flicker of agreement. I took a slow breath, picked up the bowl of mashed potatoes, and held it out. "More potatoes, anyone?" I asked, my voice impossibly steady. No one answered. The silence that followed was louder than her scream. What nobody at that table knew was that while they saw a dependent widow, a leech, I was in the midst of a silent, radical transformation. I was becoming the architect of a future they couldn't possibly imagine. 2 years later, a single piece of paper, a quarterly statement I'd accidentally left on the printer, would fall into my son's hands. And on that paper was the truth, printed in black and white, stock tickers, dividend yields, and a final net worth that would make their world tilt on its axis. This is the story of how being underestimated became my greatest asset, and how silence, patiently and strategically wielded, can speak louder than any accusation. I'm so glad to have you here with me. Follow my story until the end, and comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this has reached. And if you believe in the power of quiet strength, perhaps you'll consider subscribing to the channel. It would mean a lot. The drive home from Mark and Jessica's house that night felt different. I lived in a small 2-bedroom condo about 20 minutes away, a place I'd bought with a portion of the life insurance money my late husband, David, had left me. It was my sanctuary, but that night, the familiar streets felt alien. The accusation, Leech, echoed in my head, each repetition peeling back a layer of my composure. By the time I turned the key in my lock, the steady facade I'd maintained at dinner was crumbling. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked through the dark living room and stood at the large window overlooking the small community garden below. David and I had bought this place as a someday home, a place to downsize when the big suburban house felt too empty. He passed away from a sudden heart attack just 6 months after we signed the papers. The someday had come for me, but not for him. Grief is a strange, disorienting landscape. For the first year after David's death, I was lost in it. Mark was my only child, and he and Jessica had been my lifeline. They'd insisted I come for dinner 3 times a week. They'd helped me sort through David's belongings, their presence a buffer against the crushing silence of my new life. At first, their concern felt genuine, but slowly, a shift occurred. It was subtle, like the changing of a season. Jessica's suggestions on how I should manage my time became more frequent. Her questions about my finances, once veiled in concern, started to feel like interrogations. "Are you sure you should be buying the name brand coffee, Carol? The store brand is just as good. We saw a now hiring sign at the library. It's just part-time. It'd be good for you to get out of the house." I understood her perspective, or at least I tried to. I was a 62-year-old woman with no recent work experience. For 35 years, I had been a homemaker. It was a role David and I had chosen together. He was a geological engineer, a brilliant man who loved his work but loved his family more. He made a wonderful living, and he wanted me to have the freedom to manage our home, raise Mark, and volunteer, which I did, extensively. I ran the PTA, organized the annual town food drive, and managed the finances for our church. I wasn't idle, I was unpaid. But in Jessica's 21st century, hustle culture world, my life's work translated to a 35-year gap on a resume. The life insurance David left was substantial. He had been a meticulous planner. "I never want you to worry, Carol," he'd told me once years ago while we were signing a stack of documents with our financial advisor. "This is for you, for your security. Don't let anyone ever make you feel like you have to justify it." His words came back to me as I stood in the dark, Jessica's insult ringing in my ears. A leech. She saw the money David had left for my protection as a resource I was draining, a family pot I was lazily dipping into. She didn't see the years of love and partnership that money represented. She didn't see the lonely nights I now spent in a bed that felt far too big. She saw a dependent, an expense. That was the moment the hurt began to crystallize into something else. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was resolve. A cold, clear determination settled over me. David had given me security, but he couldn't give me respect from others. That I realized I would have to build myself. He had left me the tools, the foundation. It was up to me to construct the fortress. I finally turned on a small lamp and went to my study. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my face, and pulled up my bank accounts. There it was, a collection of numbers in a savings account, earning a pathetic 0.1% interest. It was a large sum, but it was stagnant. It was a cushion, but it wasn't working for me. It was in its own way, being a leech on its own potential. I thought about our old financial advisor, a kind man nearing retirement himself. He had managed David's portfolio with a conservative, steady hand, but he wasn't my advisor, he was David's. I needed to own this, to understand it. That night, I didn't just go to bed, I went to war, not against Jessica, but against the perception she represented. I made a silent vow, not to David, but to myself. I would not just preserve what he had given me, I would make it grow. I would learn the language of the market, the dance of stocks and bonds, the art of the investment. I wouldn't do it to prove Jessica wrong, I would do it to prove myself right. I would become so financially independent, so secure in my own right, that her opinion of me would be as significant as a fly buzzing against a window pane. The humiliation of that dinner would not be a scar, it would be my fuel. I typed "investing for beginners" into the search bar, and my new life began. The 2 years that followed were a masterclass in duality. To my family, I was still just Carol, the quiet widow, the doting grandmother to my 2 grandchildren, Lily and Noah. I lived modestly. I still bought store-brand coffee, not because I had to, but because it amused me. I continued my thrice-weekly dinners at Mark and Jessica's, a silent treaty having been established after the Leech incident. No apologies were ever offered, but the topic of my employment was dropped, replaced by a strained, fragile politeness. Jessica, a marketing manager at a mid-level tech firm, was obsessed with the outward symbols of success. Their life was a carefully curated Instagram feed. They bought a new SUV they couldn't quite afford, enrolled the kids in expensive extracurriculars, and took a trip to Disney World that I knew was financed with a credit card. Jessica would often recount the details of their spending with a kind of breathless pride, occasionally shooting me a look that was a mixture of pity and condescension. "We just had to get the premium package at the resort, Carol," she'd say, showing me pictures on her phone. "The standard rooms are so bleak. You only live once, right?" I would just smile and nod. "It looks lovely, dear." What she couldn't see was the other Carol, the one who woke up at 5 a.m., not to bake or garden, but to watch the pre-market reports from Wall Street. The woman who, after dropping the grandkids at school, wouldn't go to the mall, but to the library, borrowing books like The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham and a random walk down Wall Street. My evenings were spent not in front of the television, but in front of my laptop, enrolled in online courses about portfolio diversification, risk management, and options trading. My initial foray into the market was terrifying. I started small, moving a fraction of my savings into a brokerage account. My first investment was a simple S&P 500 index fund, the digital equivalent of dipping a toe into a vast churning ocean. I watched the daily fluctuations with a knot in my stomach. The first time the market dipped and my account showed a loss of a few $100s, I felt a wave of panic. Jessica's voice echoed in my head, "Leech, I was failing. I was gambling away David's legacy." But then I remembered a line from one of the books: "The stock market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient." I held my ground. I didn't sell. I remembered David's calm, steady nature. He never panicked. He planned. So I planned. I created spreadsheets. I tracked everything. I learned the difference between growth stocks and value stocks. I researched companies with the same intensity I used to research recipes. I looked for strong leadership, solid balance sheets, and long-term potential. I invested in technology, in healthcare, in renewable energy, sectors I believed would shape the future. I learned about REITs, real estate investment trusts, and bought into commercial properties and apartment complexes without ever having to be a landlord. My portfolio became my secret garden. I tended to it daily, pruning underperformers and planting new seeds. It was a place of quiet, thrilling power. While Jessica was bragging about her new $800 handbag, I was celebrating a quarterly dividend from a blue-chip stock that had just paid me $1,000 for, essentially, doing nothing but being patient. The irony was thick enough to choke on. They saw me living a small life, contained within the four walls of my condo, while I was digitally traversing the globe, owning tiny pieces of companies in Frankfurt, Tokyo, and Silicon Valley. My world was expanding in ways they couldn't comprehend, while theirs, propped up by debt and appearances, was slowly shrinking. One afternoon, I was babysitting Lily, who was then 8. She was doing her homework at my kitchen table while I was reviewing my portfolio on my laptop. She came over and pointed at the screen, a colorful chart of rising and falling lines. "What's that, Grandma?" she asked. "It's a graph that tells a story, sweetie," I said, simplifying it. "This line is a company, and it shows how well it's doing. When the line goes up, it means the story has a happy chapter." "Is your line going up?" she asked, her eyes wide and curious. I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Yes, Lily. My line is going up." It was during this period that the passive aggression from Jessica hit a new peak. Mark had been passed over for a promotion, a blow to both his ego and their finances. The tension in their house was palpable. I became the unwitting target of Jessica's frustration. We were at a neighborhood barbecue. Jessica was talking to another couple, loudly enough for me to hear. "It's just so hard right now. We're stretched so thin. Of course, it would be different if we had family that could, contribute. Some people are just lucky, I guess. They get to relax all day, while the rest of us work our fingers to the bone." Her words were a clear shot across the bow. The other woman glanced at me with an awkward, sympathetic expression. I felt that old, familiar sting of humiliation, the heat rising in my cheeks. But this time something was different. Beneath the hurt was a bedrock of security. Her words could still sting, but they could no longer wound me. They were just noise. I knew the truth of my life. I knew the numbers in my account. I knew the happy chapters of my story. Now I'm curious about you who listen to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar where you had to bite your tongue, knowing a truth that no one else could see? Comment below. And if you're finding strength in this story, please leave a like. It really helps the channel reach more people who might need to hear it. I excused myself from the conversation and went to get a glass of water. As I stood by the cooler, I checked my brokerage app on my phone. A tech stock I'd invested in 6 months prior was up 20%. The gain from that single stock that day was more than Mark's monthly car payment. I took a sip of water, a small secret smile playing on my lips. Let her talk. I was busy building an empire in silence. The universe has a funny way of testing the foundations of a house built on appearances. For Mark and Jessica, the first major crack appeared, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow, creeping leak. It started with Mark's job. His company announced a corporate restructuring, a sterile term for a brutal round of layoffs. Mark, who had been with the company for a decade, was suddenly out of a job. The news was a bombshell. Mark, ever the optimist, tried to frame it as an opportunity. "It's for the best," he told me over the phone, his voice tight with forced cheerfulness. I was stagnating there anyway. Time for a new challenge. But Jessica couldn't hide the panic. Her carefully curated world depended on two incomes, especially with their lifestyle. The mortgage on their oversized house, the SUV payments, the private lessons for the kids. It was a house of cards, and its king had just been removed from the table. In the weeks that followed, the strain was etched on their faces. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by clipped, tense exchanges. Jessica's posts on social media slowed to a trickle. The dinners at their house became less frequent. When I did go over, the atmosphere was heavy. They would argue in hushed, angry tones in the other room, thinking I couldn't hear. The arguments were always about the same thing: money. "We can't afford that, Jessica." "Well, maybe if you found a new job already, Mark." "I'm trying. It's not that easy." "Maybe if you hadn't insisted on the custom kitchen cabinets." It was painful to watch. I loved my son, and despite our history, I cared for Jessica. She was the mother of my grandchildren. I offered to help in small ways, buying groceries, paying for Lily's ballet lessons directly, watching the kids more often, so Jessica could pick up freelance marketing work. She accepted the help, but her pride made it a bitter pill to swallow. In her eyes, my assistance was no longer just a kind gesture, it was a confirmation of her failure and my continued existence as a financial variable in their lives. She never said thank you. She would just take the bag of groceries and say, "I was just on my way to the store anyway." About 4 months after the layoff, the situation reached a breaking point. Mark had a few promising interviews, but no offers yet. Their emergency savings were gone. The credit card bills were piling up, accumulating interest at a dizzying rate. They invited me over for dinner on a Tuesday night, which was unusual. The kids were at a sleepover. When I arrived, the house was quiet and unnervously tidy. Mark and Jessica were sitting on the couch, a stack of envelopes on the coffee table in front of them. They looked exhausted. "Mom," Mark began, his voice heavy, "we need to talk to you about something." Jessica stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. This was it. I knew what was coming. The great irony was about to play out. "We're in some trouble," Mark said, gesturing to the bills. "Some serious trouble. I haven't been totally honest about how bad things are. We're 2 months behind on the mortgage. They sent a pre-foreclosure notice." Jessica finally looked up at me, her face pale, her eyes stripped of all their usual bravado. There was only fear and desperation. "We need help, Carol," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need a loan, a significant one, just until Mark gets back on his feet. We'll pay you back every penny, with interest. We promise." The woman who had called me a leech, who had berated me for not contributing, was now asking me to save her home. A bitter, triumphant laugh threatened to bubble up inside me, but I suppressed it. Seeing her like this, so humbled and broken, didn't bring me the satisfaction I might have once craved. It just felt sad. I looked at them, the two people who were supposed to be my family, my support system, now adrift in a sea of their own making. I didn't give them an immediate answer. David's voice echoed in my mind again, "Don't let anyone ever make you feel like you have to justify it." But another part of me, the mother in me, couldn't bear to see my son lose his home. "Let me see the bills," I said calmly. They handed me the stack. Mortgage statements, credit card bills with interest rates north of 20%, a notice from the car dealership. It was a mess, a portrait of a life lived on the financial edge. I wasn't just looking at numbers, I was looking at years of poor decisions, of prioritizing wants over needs. I was quiet for a long time, studying the papers. I could feel their anxiety growing with every second of silence. "I need to think about this," I said finally, stacking the envelopes neatly. "This is a lot more than just a loan. This is about your entire financial picture. Giving you money right now would be like putting a bandage on a gaping wound. It won't fix the underlying problem." Mark deflated. "So that's a no?" I didn't say no. I replied, my voice even. I said I need to think. I need to understand the full scope of my own finances before I can make a commitment like this. It was a partial truth. I knew my finances down to the last cent, but I needed them to understand this wasn't a casual request. It wasn't me dipping into some pot of extra money. This was a decision with real consequences. I told them I would review my own accounts and get back to them in a day or two. The drive home that night was very different from the one 2 years prior. The echo in my head wasn't Jessica's insult, but her desperate plea. The power dynamic had shifted so completely, it was almost dizzying. The next afternoon, I sat down at my desk to prepare. I decided I would help them, but with strict conditions. It wouldn't be a gift, it would be a structured loan with a repayment plan. More importantly, it would come with mandatory financial counseling with me. I would teach them how to budget, how to save, how to invest. I would give them a fish, but I would also teach them how to fish. To frame the conversation, I needed to show them my own financial statement. It was the only way they would understand that I was in a position to help, and the only way they would take my financial advice seriously. I logged into my brokerage account and selected the option to print my full quarterly statement. It was a detailed, multi-page document outlining every stock, bond and fund I owned, their performance, and the final, staggering number at the bottom. I clicked print. My old printer whirred to life, spitting out the first page. Then a grinding noise. A paper jam. Of course. I sighed and got up to fix it, pulling out a mangled piece of paper. Just then my phone rang. It was my sister, calling from out of state. We fell into a long conversation, catching up on family news. I walked into the living room, completely forgetting about the document waiting in the printer's queue. An hour later, I heard a car pull up. It was Mark. He sometimes stopped by after interviews to decompress. I heard the front door open. "Mom," he called out. "You here?" "In the living room, honey." I called back. He walked into my study first, probably to leave his briefcase. "I need to print out my resume. The printer at home is out of ink," he said. And then, silence. A long, profound silence. It stretched for so long that I got up and walked to the doorway of the study. He was standing there, frozen, staring at a stack of papers in his hand. The papers he had just pulled from my printer tray. My financial statement. His face was ashen. He slowly lifted his eyes from the page to meet mine. There was no anger, no jealousy, just pure, unadulterated shock. "Mom," he breathed, his voice barely audible. "What is this?" Just then, we heard another car door slam. Jessica, she must have followed him. She walked in, her face etched with anxiety, probably expecting to hear my decision about the loan. "Mark? Carol? Is everything okay?" she asked. Then she saw the look on Mark's face, the papers in his hand. She walked closer, peering over his shoulder. Her reaction was different. Her jaw went slack. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly pale. Her eyes scanned the pages, from the list of blue-chip stocks to the 6-figure dividend income, all the way down to the 7-figure total at the bottom right of the final page. The truth was out. The Leech, it turned out, was a whale.